I learned this next technique from my friend Nick Page. Its use case is very specific, so I don't use it a lot, but in the right situation, it can really bring a photograph to life. Digital cameras have trouble accurately rendering glowing light that we see when there is direct backlighting on semi-translucent objects such as leaves, moss, and even flowers. So for example, this moss and some of these leaves that are directly backlit by the sun, they're brighter than the other parts of the image, but they don't have that brilliance and that slight glow in the atmosphere around them that they do when you're actually viewing them. So what we can do is make a luminosity selection that will target those highlights and really increase the mask contrast so that those highlights are nice and bright and the shadows are nice and dark. So up to this point, it's a lot like the luminosity painting and color dodging we've done so far, but the next step is where it changes a little bit. We're going to blur the mask. So to blur, you come in the modify section, this menu, which gets us to the other row of modify options. And this button allows us to blur the mask. And I'm going to look at the area of moss that I really want to blur and bring up that blur radius. And I find that it really depends on what you're doing and how much of a glow effect you want. But somewhere around 40 pixels I find to be the right amount for most cases. So go ahead and click OK. And now that I've got that blurred mask, I'm going to create a dodge layer. And I'm also going to select a color to do this with color. And the color I'm going to select is the actual color of the light that's coming and hitting that. So up in there, a nice bright yellowy orange. I'm going to make it really bright and a little bit saturated. Let's try that. And let's zoom in so we can see up close what's happening. Let's see, I don't need to be quite that close. So let's back out. And now as I paint along, I'm lightening and creating that glow. And it's brightening the moss, but it's also brightening some of the atmosphere or the air around the moss. And it's, again, like I said, creating that sort of glow that we actually see when we have this sort of bright backlighting. And up here on the moss, down through there. Let me zoom out a little bit more now that we get the idea of what we're doing. Try to find all the places where I want this to go, into these leaves and up into this moss and these leaves up here. Now you'll notice that I am also dodging the fog because it's a similar tonal value as the leaves. And so in a minute here, we're going to have to decide what we're going to do. The moss looks great, but do I want to apply the effect to all the fog as well? Or do I want to erase it out of the fog? Well, let me just see what would happen if I went around the sun here and intentionally just painted it into more parts of the image. I might like it, but I do feel like it's a bit strong. So this is where I would probably come back with a zone selection for the brightest areas. So there's that really bright zone mask, and I may expand it by pulling the slider a little bit this way, somewhere in there, and maybe brightening it up this way as well, and load that as a selection. And with the eraser at a low flow, just maybe 20%, I can then slightly remove it from the fog. And I can also brush along the tops of, like here, where I think I actually overexposed some of these little pieces of moss and kind of blew them out. So if I want to recover those, I can do that by erasing through that zone selection. Yeah, I think everything else looks pretty good. So let's zoom out. I'll go ahead and deselect, and now let's check it out. Before, after, before, after. And let's try it on this image. Again, similar situation, backlighting on tree branches. So you find the luminosity mask that's going to target what you want. Add some mask contrast. Try to select just those brightest highlights. Then come to here and blur that mask about 40 pixels. Create the dodge layer. Select the color. It's going to be right here in the brightest branches. And now I can paint through the blurred luminosity selection and paint in the glow everywhere in the image where the backlighting is. Down in here, up in here. There's some faint light rays coming through the mist. I have to decide, do I want to bring those in a little bit more as well? So I am going to paint along those and bring that in. All right, let's see how it looks. So before, after, and if I'm blowing out areas, I can come back to a zone mask for those brightest areas like that. And I might even narrow those down quite a bit. Get them really dialed in on just the very brightest areas, like that. Load that as a selection, grab the eraser. Up here, I don't mind it so much. It's just in these areas where it was a little hotter than I wanted it to be. Something like that. Before, after, before, after. And of course, you can always use opacity of the layer if you want to fine tune it. And there we go. Pretty simple. Like I said, it's similar to what we've already been doing, but there's just so many uses for the original luminosity painting idea. I'm showing you techniques that I use that I find useful in my work, but the uses for this concept or this idea of luminosity painting and modifying it for different situations, I think the opportunities are pretty much limitless.